Good afternoon, everyone. Let's try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. There we go. That was a bit of energy. I know it's the end of the day, and I'm the last thing probably between you and dinner, or almost last thing. So I better do a good job of keeping you all awake and making this entertaining. So I'm Chris Reddington. I'm a senior enterprise advocate at GitHub, and I'm here today to talk a little bit of a story to you. Put your hands up if you've ever uttered those words at any point, "It works on my machine." That was 100% of the room, I think. Awesome. Now, we've uttered those words, but they're probably words that we don't really want to say. We'd rather be able to have things working the first time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some things in GitHub that can help you out with that. Something called GitHub Codespaces. And then we'll be taking a bit more of a journey along how artificial intelligence can help you be more productive as well with something called GitHub Copilot. So first off, before we jump into any of that, who's heard of this company and this platform called GitHub before? Good. I can hear a few giggles there as well. Okay. And who's an open source maintainer here or contributed to open source? Excellent. On behalf of everyone in the room, thank you for what you do, first off. Who uses GitHub in their day-to-day internal development as well? Quite a large number. Okay, good to see. I normally see more of a skew towards the open source rather than the inner source way of developing. So for those of you who maybe didn't know, didn't put your hand up there, just in case, GitHub is really the home of open source software. If you think about GitHub, you probably immediately think of projects like Kubernetes, Vue, others that are hosted out there on GitHub. 83 million developers use the platform today. 4 million organizations contribute into 2.6 billion contributions per year. So there's a lot that we've learned along the way and how we want to keep moving the platform forwards, how we want to keep evolving the platform. And something at the heart of what GitHub does is developer experience. Now, I asked some very leading questions at the beginning there about it works on my machine and some of those scenarios that we've encountered day to day, because actually, everyone should give themselves a pat on the back here because being a developer is hard. We've got to understand first how all of these concepts work. We then got to understand the latest framework, the latest language, only to find that someone's decided, hey, we're going to rewrite that project and we're going to do another project as well, and we've got to skill up on something else. So that developer experience and that ability to be able to be as productive as we can be and make that experience really flawless is something really, really important. And this is really part of what GitHub does. And you'll see this over the course of the few services that we'll be looking at here today. Now, typically whenever I do this type of talk, people are normally expecting to see something like this. GitHub have come along. They're going to be talking about GitHub repositories because my code is stored in GitHub. And that's pretty much what I use GitHub for. But actually, there's so much more that you can do with GitHub. So if you are interested, I'll be doing a longer talk on Thursday about inner source with GitHub, how you can take those open source practices and translate them into what you do on a day-to-day basis. Having said that, we are going to look slightly at repositories, even though I made that little joke. What we'll be talking about is Codespaces, and to use GitHub Codespaces, it first needs a GitHub repository. Anyone use GitHub Codespaces already? Familiar? Only a couple of hands. Awesome. We're getting to the part of the presentation now where I can start adding some value. So GitHub Codespaces, imagine that scenario where you've joined a new company, you've joined a new organization, or maybe you're just in your organization and you're moving to another team. Maybe that team uses different frameworks, different libraries, etc. You've got to go through that process. You've got to set up your dev machine. You've got to install your IDE. You've got to install the latest frameworks, only to find the project still doesn't build. And this is now, what, 6 hours in on my second or third day, and I just want to start being productive. I just want to start writing code and being able to work with the team. Now, the idea behind GitHub Codespaces is it's an on-demand development environment. So rather than needing the machine that I've got right in front of me, we rely on the cloud. We rely on this on-demand environment that I can easily spin up an environment configured to my exact needs for that particular project. So actually, we use Codespaces at GitHub. So before we shipped Codespaces, GitHub/GitHub is our internal repository for github.com. It's actually a huge monolithic repository, and the team did a lot of work to optimize that. There's gigabytes and gigabytes of files in that repository, and they've done a ton of optimization to take it from what was days in a very brittle setup of using scripts, etc., to get that environment configured on local machines, to I think it was 15, 20, or 45 minutes using Codespaces initially, to now less than 10 seconds. So we're talking really drastic changes in terms of being able to get that development environment up and going very quickly. So that's enough talking. Let's actually go ahead and take a look at some demos. So you can see here I've got a repository. It's just a private repository that I've got in one of my organizations. And all it is a bookstore. Nothing exciting, nothing spectacular. It's an internal application we've been writing, and it's a Maven project. It builds a standalone jar file, and that's probably as much as we need to know for the context. Just interested in case anyone's wondering, if you are thinking about using GitHub internally, having README files like this, which explain what the project is, how you build it, how you actually get going with it, is a good practice to follow. So again, I'll sprinkle some of these as we go through here as well. Now, if I just scroll up to the top here, a lot of you are probably familiar with this kind of green code button. You click that green code button, you get the link to your GitHub repository, you clone it to your local machine, and you start writing your code. That's typically the workflow people are going through, is what I've found. So you see something like this. But you'll notice that I have this other tab here called Codespaces. And I can go and click on that, and I've got another green button. So I'm going to go click this green button as well. What's happening here is, behind the scenes, a container is getting spun up. So you'll see in a moment, it'll start saying container creating, container building. Now, to show you what's actually happening, let me jump back to this repository, because there's something quite subtle and important what's happening on this page here. You can see I've got this folder called a .dev container. So if I jump into that, we can see a couple of files. One is, oops, there we go, some background updates happening there. We've got a dev container.json, and we've got a Docker Compose YAML file. You could equally use a Docker file as well, but for this application, we use Docker Compose. Let me jump into dev container and walk you through what's happening. So you can see that this is just some kind of JSON definition. So it's a schema, effectively, for what I want to appear in my development environment when it spins up. So you can see that we've got this Docker Compose file here, and that's referencing that file that we saw a moment ago. This is for dev. We're going to open up some ports, port 8080, and then we do some mapping as well, just to notify what we want to happen in that dev environment when we use them. We've then got some extensions. So who uses Visual Studio Code as their daily driver? A handful, okay. The experience that we'll see in a moment is very, very similar to Visual Studio Code, you'll see. And the extensions that you can use in VS Code, you can absolutely use in Codespaces as well. And what this section is saying is, these are the extensions that we want to be recommended by default when you spin up this environment. So if I'm brand new to the job and I don't know which extensions may be useful for that day-to-day work, the environment has me sorted for that. It guides me along that process. You can see I've got some settings in terms of configuring that environment, and some post-create commands to run there as well. And then, of course, if I just scroll back up to the top, take a look at the Docker Compose YAML file, you can see this is just very similar to any other Docker Compose file that we may have seen in the past. Nothing particularly exciting there. But in the time it took me to explain to you what this is and how it works behind the scenes, I've got my dev environment configured, ready to go. And I can assure you there's nothing on this machine whatsoever. I joined GitHub 3-4 months ago now. I've still not installed a single dependency on my machine, because I use things like this, Codespaces, to help me be productive. And just as a reminder, at the very, very top of the screen, that is an address bar. So we are absolutely operating in the web browser here. This is not VS Code on my local machine, though I can use VS Code on my machine to connect to Codespaces as well, if I prefer. So let's just zoom in a bit here, make sure you can all see this, and start making a couple of tweaks. So this is a project that I mentioned, a bookstore project here. I'm going to go ahead, just start making some changes. So I'm going to go ahead and Command-Shift-P, just like I would locally, run a task here. And I'm going to code a new feature. Let's go for the book star rating. I'm going to create a new branch, and what's happening there behind the scenes, I've created a few new files, some new functionality there. So you can see that actually the experience that I've got is just like VS Code running on my local machine. I've got my changes here, my staged changes that I want to commit up to my repository. So I might go ahead and commit those. But actually, before I do commit them, I want to follow that good practice. I want to go ahead, build those changes locally or cloud local because it's not on my machine. It's in some container running in GitHub, and check that that is all working as expected. So again, I'm just going to run another of these tasks, but you'll notice that I've got this terminal right by here. So I can use the terminal exactly as I would, go and run a Docker build, for example, or any other commands where I have the tools and the frameworks installed there for me. Now, because I don't trust my typing skills when I'm doing demos, I'm just going to go build container here. And you'll see what's happening on the terminal is it's now building that Docker file for us. It will ask me for a label in a sec, and then it will proceed with the rest of the Docker file build. There we go. So whilst that's happening, what we're going to do now is we're going to run that container on that code space remotely up in the cloud somewhere. None of this is happening on my machine. And in the space of what, we've been here 11 minutes so far, I've been able to explain what it is, get that environment configured, and now we're about to do our first build and check that feature is working as expected. None of those tools on my machine whatsoever. So that build is now complete. And if I now go and run a task again, we will run the container this time, port 8080. And then what you can see is on the bottom right, we've got this pop-up to say, hey, the application is running on port 8080. Super. Let me open that in my browser. And what you'll notice in a moment, there we go, you can see there's some kind of connecting to the forwarded port happening there. There's some kind of authentication happening there as well. In just a moment, what we will see is the application itself will then load up. So we'll jump back to a sec because I want to show you something before it pops up. You can see next to that terminal tab, I've also got these ports. So when I run these local commands, you can see it's just using a Docker run here, interactive mode, mapping the port 8080. You can see that I've actually got this visibility tab here. So a private mode, private to organization, or public. So if you think about that from a collaboration perspective, you're working with your colleagues internally, working with a customer, you can easily go ahead and change the visibility of that port. That authentication that happens in the very beginning there that you saw, we can change who's actually allowed to go and see that. So there's some quite nice functionality there from a collaboration perspective. Speaking of collaboration, if you've used your extensions as well, you might be familiar with some of the live sharing capabilities built into VS Code. Again, all my extensions are available for me. So if I wanted to go and do something like live share, I can go ahead, find it, install the extension, and then it's there and available for me. So your favorite extensions are there for you. Now, some of you might be wondering, okay, Chris, that's kind of cool, but I heard this thing where if I press the dot on a GitHub repository on my keyboard, it just opens up some kind of lightweight editor. And that's true. You can get a lightweight editor just by pressing dot on your keyboard in a GitHub repository. But the challenge here is this is all happening in the cache on my local machine. If I'm making some long changes, taking me hours and hours or days, what's going to happen? My cache is going to get depleted, and then I've lost all my files there. So if you're doing something a bit longer in terms of development, need that compute to go and run the terminal locally, for example, you'd want to go ahead and use something like Codespaces. So I'm just going to go try one more time because it looks like that didn't quite work first time around. There you go. You can see the application is there running live on that code space somewhere in GitHub, not on my machine. And I'm able to start doing that local bit of development there. So that's super. I'm going to go commit those changes. Book star rating functionality implemented. And we are good to go. And what you'll see in a sec, I get prompted to make the branch, we'll get a pop-up to say, hey, do you want to create a pull request? So again, it's a really nice integrated experience with that whole kind of flow that I'm used to, creating the pull request to merge it into main. So that's GitHub Codespaces very briefly. Now, I want to move us on to talk about the next aspect, which I'm actually pretty excited about. I really like GitHub Copilot, and you'll see why in a moment. It's kind of scary when you start using it, and it's fun when I'm doing demos like this, because I quite never know what's going to happen. It could work really well. It could maybe just give me nothing back. So let's hope the demo gods are helpful for us today. So GitHub Copilot, in essence, is an AI pair programmer. So it's an extension available in NeoVim, JetBrains, Visual Studio, and Visual Studio Code. And you can use that to help you be even more productive, get suggestions on maybe changes you could make to your code, maybe improvements or ideas that you could add. Because again, think of what I said in the beginning there. Being a developer is hard, and we've got to remember so many different language patterns, so many different ways of working, actually taking some of that cognitive load away from us, helping make us more productive so we can think about those overall problems, how we're going to solve it, the architecture, and let the pair programmer then help us out in terms of writing the code. So let me just jump over here to Visual Studio Code running on my local machine. The reason I'm starting here is because I want you to see that there's no Git repository, there's no GitHub repository backing what's going on here. I've just got my Copilot extension at the very bottom of the screen there, and nothing else. There's no GitHub repository backing this. So I'm going to change my language mode here to be Java. I'm going to go and create a bank account class. And that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to leave that empty. And the next stage, if I'm scaffolding something out, that's kind of scary how quickly it does something. I'm going to pause here, actually, because this is a really good point to talk about what's just happened here. Context. I've given GitHub Copilot some context in this file here, so it knows I'm creating a bank account class. So actually, you know what? That kind of looks pretty good to me on the types of things that I would expect to see. But actually, I'm going to prolong this a little bit more. I'm going to say, right, let's define some instance variables. So we've got a balance, an account ID, a password. That's probably good. There we go. It's suggesting to me, hey, you probably want to make a constructor. There we go. Good. That looks good to me. Yeah, I probably do want to write some methods. And this is the hard bit about doing demos for Copilot, is you don't quite know what's coming next. There we go. Get balance as an example. A fun one that I like to do is something like, I don't know, let's say withdraw class. Now, actually, sometimes Copilot isn't as intelligent as that. It's detected that we're making a bank account. For a bank account, you don't want to withdraw funds if there's no funds to withdraw. So it's already embedded that logic into the suggestion to come back to me. Now, I might think, you know what? That looks okay, but maybe there's a better suggestion for me. I can just hit Control and Enter. And then what you'll see happen is a load of suggestions here, about 10 suggestions are synthesized based on the input and the context that I have given GitHub Copilot from the file I'm working in, sent to the GitHub Copilot service, and then those are given back to me. So we can see there's actually a suggestion here even giving me something like deposit as well, and toString and some other things. That might be a bit much, but you can kind of see the idea here that it's all based on the context and what I give to Copilot. So we'll explain a little bit about what Copilot is and how it works in a moment, but there's one other demo that I want to show you here, and this is always quite a fun one. Again, depending on how this works and how this goes. So let me just zoom out. Maybe I need to refresh. We're going to make an additional function in that bookstore application there. So if you think about a bookstore, there are probably different things that you want to go and search on or filter on. So I'm going to go ahead to my bookutils class, and in here I've got a getSampleBooks method. Nothing exciting, it just it creates a list, adds a number of books to it. Now, if I'm creating a bookstore, I probably want to do something like a filter by book author, for example. Now, you can see that, again, it's based on the context of that file. It knows there's a list of books. It knows we're in the kind of bookstore environment. You probably want to filter by bookstore author there. So great, it's gone and done that. What's always fun then is I break a new couple of lines here and it goes, actually, do you want to do that by title as well? And you can kind of get the idea. There's that context within the files there that I have an author, that I have a title, and I want to go and filter based upon those. Now, I'm going to ask a very, very leading question here, so I hope you are all very ready for this. Who loves writing tests? There's a few of us, okay. But I heard the laughs there as well. I know there's an equally other end of the spectrum. Not everyone likes writing tests. So let's go and do something else. Let's go and write a filter by title.java. Let's call it filter book by title. You can see we've got that scaffolded out for us here. And I can go ahead and say, right, filter book test the filter book title method. And here we go. So you can see already there's a little bit of strangeness happening here because I've given the name one thing, filter books by title, but in the comment, I'm saying test it. So let me change this to filter books by title test as an example. There we go, and we'll change that. And let's try that again. Test the filter by title method. And then if I actually just skip ahead here and do a Control-Enter, we'll see what kind of results it gives us back here. So you can see actually there's an assert equals in there. So getting the sample books, asserting that the number of books is equal to 3, for example. 3 of them contain the word the, apparently. I'm always really interested to see how good it is at picking things up like this. It did look like there were 3 there, actually, so there we go. It even went to that level of context to understand how many are in there and populating it for us. So that looks pretty good to me. I'm going to go accept that solution. And of course, I need to bring in my imports here as well. So we'll go and import those. Here we go. Oops. And there we go. I've written a test without having to write a test. I need to add another package in there, but again, you can see how quickly I've been able to come up with that method, add the test in as well, and just think about the problem that I'm trying to solve rather than writing all of the boilerplate code, all of the bits and pieces that actually make up that code. So I think I've shown enough magic at this stage. You're probably thinking, okay, Chris, this is kind of scary. You've just been getting some comments flying back at you, just providing a few lines of context here. So let me explain what's going on behind the scenes here. So in the demo, at the very beginning, you saw that I started with a code editor. You saw I started with an empty Visual Studio Code project, no files, no link to a GitHub repository, etc. So first, GitHub Copilot is an extension. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. So there is Visual Studio Code, there is Visual Studio, NeoVim, and the JetBrains set of IDEs as well. And that extension is what's working behind the scenes to give me those suggestions. So it's firing off to the GitHub Copilot service, the context of the files that I'm working in, so the neighboring files, etc. Sending that context up to GitHub Copilot, and I get some suggestions back as a result. Now, again, just really want to stress, it doesn't matter if you're using Azure DevOps, GitLab, Bitbucket, a private Git server hosted somewhere. What matters is the fact that it's going from my IDE, there's that extension, and that is what's sending it up to the GitHub Copilot service there. Okay, so then at that point, you're probably thinking, okay, Chris, but you just mentioned context is important, and context is being sent to GitHub Copilot, so what's actually being sent up? And are you using that to train the model to make it even better? So correct, you would be right that there is some context being sent to the GitHub Copilot service, but it's purely for a like a transient way of sending that to get the recommendation, and then it's discarded. It is not used to enhance that model. The things which have been trained for the Copilot model behind the scenes are public GitHub repositories in case you're interested. So that's that aspect. Now, for the overall, how is this actually working? What's going on here? The analogy that I like to use is think about something like a translation tool. Maybe use Google Translate, Bing Translate, whatever favorite tool you prefer to use. If you wanted to translate a phrase from English to French, French to Spanish, Spanish to German, German to Italian, those providers haven't programmed in every single combination of words, every single combination of strings, and matched them to a language in another language. So it's not a copy and paste, it's not a referential model, it's not referring back to the data set and just spitting something else back out. What is actually happening is the model behind the scenes is building up the semantics, the context, the language patterns based around what is going on in the language. So an if statement and then this thing and then this thing might be a common pattern in the bank account class, for example, like the withdraw we saw a moment ago. That might be a pattern that comes up time and time again, and then that gets ingested then as a pattern which can be brought back. So what GitHub Copilot is doing is writing novel code and providing language patterns based on all of that public code that has been ingested and learned from. So it's building up that semantic database and that knowledge base, if you like, there. So, conscious time that we've got a few minutes left, we talked about the editors that it's available in. I also just want to talk a bit about the studies that we've been running as well, because this is, I think, really important to show that this isn't just kind of magic. There is actually some research behind all of this, which is happening as well. And the TLDR of this is we've done a lot of research back when it was in a kind of private stage, and we're still ongoing with research as well. But we've had over 2,000 developers get involved as part of that technical preview. Primarily professional developers, there were some hobbyists and students in there as well. But you can see some of the numbers here, they really speak for themselves. So if I just highlight some of them. Perceived productivity, I am more productive, 88%. You know, there's some real big gains there. And just because you're being more productive doesn't mean you suddenly have to start working on something else. It means you can start thinking more creatively about the problems that you're trying to solve. Maybe thinking about those architectural patterns from a development perspective, or maybe there are new features that you want to go and write. So actually having that productivity gain helps you maybe do some more of the things that you actually want to do rather than writing individual lines of code potentially. And again, everyone's different, but speaking with folks, there's an interesting balance there. The other thing is conserving mental energy. I mentioned at the beginning, being a developer is hard. We're not just developers anymore. We're kind of stepping into this cloud world as well. We're expected to run cloud services. And because we're expected to run cloud services, we're expected to architect as well. So all of that kind of mental energy of having to think about programming, think about the architecture, think about everything else, if we can let the tool help us be more productive, then it gives us some of those brain cycles to help us maybe think a little bit more and just think about what is important. The analogy I always like to use is an accountant. Sure, an accountant could go and do all of your tax returns and add everything up in their head, but they've probably got a calculator or Excel or something else there to help them out because, you know, that's not what they want to focus on. They want to look at the bigger picture there. The other angle is some additional research that was done with a group, I think, of, it was around 95 developers, I think. There we go, 95 professional developers. Their challenge was to build a web server, I think using Node, if memory serves me right. What you can see is actually the developers that used GitHub Copilot, 78% of them finished. The ones that didn't, 70%. So there was still a good amount that finished in each. But look at the difference in the time that it took them to write that server between the two different examples there. Can't go into too much detail because we've only got 1 minute left here, but there's a load of great blogs available out there for you to go and look at this. All of the information I've taken here is all publicly available. I'm going to be around as well here and down at the booth downstairs in the expo hall. I've got tons of stickers here, so please come by, say hello. Everyone loves stickers. And with that, there is some more news coming soon. Stay tuned. You can only use Codespaces right now in Teams and Enterprise, whereas Copilot, you can only use it from an individual basis. But I can tell you more about that if you come and say hello. Otherwise, we've got a few sessions coming up later this week as well. And that is me done. Thank you very much.